This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman. This is London FinTech Podcast, episode 119, brought to you in association with Blue Motor Finance and Smart Pension, and it's time for the New Year special. Today we focus on a super mega big picture topic, which must be the most important topic of our times. Is FS and tech ushering in an Orwellian tyranny rather than freeing the people? As bad as things are in the West, and if you studiously avoid politics, you clever soul, you may have no idea that anything is wrong at all in Eden. Things are, however, far worse in China. The social credit score should put ice into the heart of anyone's soul. Total surveillance and a system of monitoring and rewarding/punishing the smallest behaviours which Western governments must be drooling over. Actually, Styx Hexenhammer 666 made an interesting observation. The Chinese social credit score is only worse in degree, not in nature, as we have deplatforming and unpersoning on the internet big time over here too. Again, as those of you who are unpolitical, you may not have noticed, but anyone who is political will have noticed, all sorts of bans, shadow bans, delisting, demonetizing and sheer unpersoning from the internet, the public commons of the information age, are happening. I guess, depending on how much indie media you imbibe, you will either know or not know that FS/BigTech is very busy right now creating an Orwellian dystopia of digitally unpersoning people. We've seen this for some time in social media, with principally those strong dissenters from the PC orthodoxy being banned from platforms. In the information age, this is the equivalent of being knocked back, say, from living in the Bronze Age to the Stone Age. However, by the end of 2018, the BigTech thought police, prodded of course by governments, ever anxious to maintain their narratives and cover up policy failures, have got far more vicious. We hear a lot about financial inclusion, but its sinister evil twin is deliberate financial exclusion, thanks to the likes of MasterCard, PayPal and Patreon. Oligopoly is the watchword here. MasterCard, Visa and Amex, for example, controlling 97% of US card processing. PayPal controls 2/3 of internet spending. Patreon was the only main such site to date, which gives their corporate overlords huge power over the world. But wasn't the internet supposed to liberate people, to connect them directly in conversation or in finance via peer-to-peer? What has gone wrong when instead of decentralisation of power and communications, tech has led to the greatest concentration of global power ever known to man? As Niall Ferguson has pointed out, the previous information revolution, the Gutenberg printing press, was supposed to usher in only good. However, it led to a schism in the Western Church, which led to centuries of intra-Christian wars. Does that remind you of the polarisation we're seeing at the moment? And it also led to the text called Malleus Maleficarium, which led to the burning of witches and was super popular. In the same way, the internet has led to a schism between the cultural Maoists, who have used it well to further their agenda of cultural destruction of the old to make way for the glorious new, and the vast majority who don't believe, as a recent nonsensical example from Brighton Council said, new transgender guidelines teach Brighton school children that all genders may have periods. The burning of witches is for sure going on big time. Deplatforming, banning and now removal of FS services for thought criminals. It is the failure to stay decentralised that is leading to all the sins, all the Orwellianism of the internet age. What can be done about it? Can we use tech as a force for good? As a way of empowering the people, not empowering billionaires and ever more distant bureaucrats? But before pondering on whether tech and fintech can save the day, we do need to dive into what we all rather take for granted, the phase shift from the manufacturing/services age to the information age. It runs like a stick of rock through not just every podcast but all of our lives. However, we never get the chance to dive deep into the past to see what lessons can be learnt about prior phase shifts. In a way, the executive summary is that whilst the human being is the most adaptable creature on the planet, adaptation takes time, especially in our super complex society. The following quote from Chomsky seems apposite about the big picture right now. The gay 90s, the last decade of the last century, were very similar. There were times, like now, where enormous power was shifting towards very narrow sectors of wealth and privilege, whose goal was to undermine functioning democracy, to convert the society into roughly a two-tiered society. So said Chomsky. That sounds familiar, when one sees how the word populism, for example, is used to defame citizens' wishes worldwide and their legitimate concerns. And in passing, kudos to former Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, for pointing out just this fact, that populism is being used to delegitimise citizens' genuine concerns and fears. He also wins plaudits for pointing out that massive immigration in the UK is leading to UK companies not bothering to train British workers. Brackets, talk in the UK of a so-called hostile climate is utter spin. It's running at about 400,000 per annum compared to the target of 100,000 that May set in 2010. Close brackets. So, on to tech phase shifts in the past. All technological change brings winners and losers from the Stone Age onwards. So changes are to be expected, and they are not always for the better. We saw changes in society from hunter-gatherers to farmers, from Paleoliths to Neoliths. Although most all of us are children of the Neoliths, it is important to note that the archaeological evidence was that Neoliths' skeletons were shorter than Paleoliths, and skeleton length is the archaeological proxy for community health. The farmers eventually won out, not as they were healthier than the hunter-gatherers, but simply as they were fatter, and hence their women more fertile, and hence they outbred the Paleoliths. Farming also created a totally different relationship with the land. The concept of owning, of hoarding, of permanent settlements came in, and out went the idea that you could only own what you could carry. It is no exaggeration to say that the huge wealth accumulation that we see today, and its accumulation in the hands of a tiny few, along with massive militarism, is a direct consequence of this change. We have to fast forward a long time to get to the next massive revolution, the Industrial Revolution, with new technologies seeing a huge movement from the land to cities and factories. Once again, this was at a huge cost to society, in that the lives of many became nasty, brutal and short, toiling in mines and factories. But eventually some labour rights came in, technology improved, and we kind of worked out most of the excesses of industrialisation, at least in the West. In the Chinese sweatshops that make the ever-so-trendily marketed iPhones, the suicide nets in place on the landings remind us that conditions remain intolerable for workers in this world to this time. For all of us alive now, we're living in another massive phase shift. Farming produces food. We have more than enough. Indeed, over my lifetime, the world as a whole has gone from not having enough food, in the UK, for example, post-war rationing only ended in the 1950s, to a surplus. The major problem these days is obesity and obesity-related conditions such as diabetes. Moving away from primary to secondary, factories and machines produce more than enough cars, fridges, washing machines for our purpose. So we move on to the information age. If the prior two major shifts led to more losers than winners, we might expect to see the same again. It might also take a long time to work through the adverse consequences. An all too sad adverse consequence of social media that we've mentioned before is the disastrous increase in mental illness and depression. Study after study has shown this, and that it is affecting younger and younger people. So that's not exactly tyranny, although to stretch a point, it kinda is, as the platforms put masses of energy and research into ensuring that they are as hypnotic as possible. I bet there aren't many of you out there who haven't had to, at some point, deliberately rein in your own use of your phone and platforms after it has started to do your head in. But moving on from the simple aspect of social media, that using it is demonstrably not good for your health and soul, before we look at the impact of the information age and its priesthood in tech, we have to look at the power players. After all, a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon can save lives. In the hands of a madman it can kill. So in whose hands is tech being used or abused? In the Neolithic transformation, we can assume that small tribes just basically sat down and started cultivating. Distances were vast in those days, and the theme was localism. It is no coincidence that we hear little of localism these days, and only of globalism as the internet obliterates distance. In the Industrial Revolution, likewise, things were done on a small scale. Stephenson's rocket was made in one small place. The UK state at that time has been described as minarchism, the minimal possible state, and companies were not only super rare, but needed royal permission to have limited liability. So the power of technology was in the hands of a few whose individual power was relatively limited. Of course, as time progressed, by the late 19th century, particularly in the US, we had a massive outgrowth of robber barons and corporations. It is noteworthy that the strongest opponents of corporations were the Republicans in the US, who argued that wage slavery was only one step removed from actual slavery. In the UK, Conservatives argued that opening up limited liability would lead to huge problems. Limited liability breaks every convention behind every legal system in the world. If you wrap yourself in limited liability, done for a few pounds online, then suddenly, for vast ranges of your behaviour, you no longer pick up the tab for the full consequence of your actions. As travel got faster, as communications improved, companies grew to unprecedented size. Over the 20th century, the state ballooned in size. In the UK, we went from minarchism, well described by A.J.P. Taylor's point that before the First World War, the average Englishman's contact with the state was the village post office and the local bobby, to a point now where the state and its whole host of agents are near ubiquitous. Just to run a podcast, a super unregulated sector, for now, I'm sure that won't last for long, I need a company, accountants and lawyers, as well as filling in multiple tax returns, VAT returns, etc., etc. When I drive on the roads, there are speed limits, speed cameras. When I go into London, I'm tracked and surveilled. The state in Europe generally takes and spends about half of all the money you earn. This surely makes mafia rates of protection look competitive. It is not just the state where power is concentrated in the hands of a few, but in corporations which are, in Chomsky's memorable phrase, unaccountable totalitarian states. If you can in most countries vote out the current set of politicians, if only for another set of politicians, then at least you can vote them out. Apple CEO Tim Cook recently said that it is a sin to not ban bad people from tech platforms. Amazing attitude, especially when it's him that's going to decide what is bad and what is good. And an even more amazing maniacal religious vocabulary. After all, sin? Anyway, if you don't like him, you try voting Tim Cook out of office. You can't. I can't. Yet Cook has far more power over lives worldwide than most politicians we can imagine. Try similarly voting out Zuckerberg or Dorsey et al. An astonishing over 90% of online searches are through Google. We live in an information age and that's centred on one company as a monopoly. And in passing, Google's own research has shown that how it presents information affects elections in all countries. So in defence of tech as such, it might be said, though I feel for reasons we shall come on to, this is only partially true, that tech is like a knife, it depends who wields it. Originally tech was presented and had the potential to be something liberating. I think it still can be, although the most decentralised technology, Bitcoin, in a parable for our times, became a super centralised oligopoly and subject to internal political wranglings. Tech is not so often wielded in the hands of surgeons. Maybe that will take a century or two to clean up, as did the Industrial Revolution. Rather, it is wielded mostly by West Coast billionaires, whom it would be wrong to call madmen. However, as we've seen big time this year, they absolutely have strong common political leanings, and despite the predilection for coming down hard on cultural imperialism per se, they practice more cultural imperialism than anyone in history ever. Hypocrisy. Using their own standards, they control discourse between individuals worldwide, banning those mostly who oppose their politics, whilst turning a blind eye to the real terrorists, from Hezbollah to the globalist brown shirts Antifa, oddly well organised all over the world. And just as oddly, suddenly, things like, for example, so-called trans go from being something that was classified as a mental illness around the world in DSM-4 and DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manuals of Psychiatry, to something which is all of a sudden foisted upon children as something approaching a lifestyle choice. And little mention, of course, that as per the largest survey running over a 30-year period, 10 to 15 years post-gender reassignment surgery, suicide rates are 20 times the societal average. Naive tech folks talk about making more and more of our lives virtual and app-based. Dudes, be careful what you wish for. You're handing power over to the oligopolists, to a handful of global barons who, spurred on by politicians, love nothing better than banning those guilty of wrongthink. It's the equivalent of Nazi book burning. And the most banned, of course, are not the real extremists, but those who hold up a light to the failings of the politicians and corporates, whether it be Tommy Robinson, whose name next to no middle-class person will ever mention in this country, or Sargon of Akkad. Actually, these are well-chosen random examples, in both cases, as people power came to their rescue. Anyone living on a diet of mainstream media will quotes know, unquotes, that Tommy is a racist, Nazi, thug, etc., etc. However, that's rather incompatible with around 2/3 people worldwide signing a petition for his release after the worst show trial in the UK ever. He ends up in solitary confinement after not only not pleading guilty, he wasn't actually even charged of anything. And on something which, if he'd been charged and had been found guilty, contempt of court, no one has ever gone to prison and the mainstream media regularly falls foul of. The last rally to free him included politicians from over half a dozen countries, including a US congressman. And he even had his own song, How They Rule You, written about his case by Owen Benjamin. Plenty of class hatred. This seems, by the way, to be the exception from the bullshit hate speech rules, fully practiced by the London media, came his way, with everyone from Farage through all the usual blue church media, the BBC, the Guardian et al., and barristers proclaiming his guilt and literally inventing facts to suit themselves. He actually had a hell of a time to try and find a barrister to represent him. Sadly for them all, the highest court in the land and the Lord Chief Justice himself utterly dismissed his trial as a farce and freed him on the spot. His real problem, of course, apart from being working class, is opposing the state, in particular on the issue, of which he's been the longest campaigner, of gang sex abuse of children. Lord Pearson, the only lord to raise questions on this topic, estimates that there have been millions of rapes of children across the country. Whilst Tommy was arrested, tried and locked up in hours, the animals who raped and tortured vulnerable children in this case were free on bail for a year while their trials took place. They were even on bail after sentencing, when, as I recall, one packed his suitcase and legged it back to Pakistan to avoid prison. Tommy's autobiography, Enemy of the State, gets 4.9 stars from nearly 2,000 reviews on Amazon. For anyone who's seen the YouTube of his speech to the Oxford Union, it's impossible to conclude he's anything like the media image. The guy is a working class hero. If there's to be a peasants' revolt in the UK, and all too often this year I felt we need one, he will be the heart of it. Our last peasants' revolt was in 1381, so we're definitely overdue one, although we're put to shame by the gilets jaunes of the French, who are far, far better at street protests and overcoming tyranny. Tommy has been, at least in the short term, saved by people, power and tech. 20 years ago, you couldn't get the better part of 1 million signatures worldwide. More recently, and far less controversial, but occasionally prone not to letting his fists fly, but his words, is Sargon of Akkad, the veteran of Gamergate, which marked the start of this PC, police, media against the people war online many years ago. He rose to prominence with his weak and stupid YouTubes, which it became clear in a fascinating interview he did with Steve Bannon, someone else who, if you listen to him in his own words, not other people's words, makes far more sense than you would ever imagine, he had risen to the notice of Bannon. Sargon, who I've met in passing, is a nice guy, classic English liberal, i.e. live and let live, is predominantly outraged by the PC bullshit. I pointed out to him that he gets more views of his content than most of the UK newspapers. Sargon was deplatformed with zero notice by Patreon, which meant that his income from sponsors immediately, with no notice, no right of appeal and no violations of terms of service, went from thousands of dollars a month to zero. Impressively, this has led to outrage across a whole host of indie media stars, all along the lines that if Sargon is banned, then 99% of us should be banned, as he really is a radical centrist. In passing, he was getting a kicking from the real ethno-state far right at the time of his banning, not your BBC Guardian definition of alt-right as being anybody who voted for Brexit. Right now it's looking like Patreon, who had prior form for banning the luscious Lauren Southern on grounds which in passing are now official Italian government policy, will be the first major fintech in the broadest sense to follow the get woke, go broke slogan. If I were to sum up the problem, it's a bit like the Wild West, a phrase in passing I do not like at all, as it wasn't the Wild West but the Native Americans' West in the early days. Big Tech has appointed itself sheriff, and what it says goes, and if you don't agree, you can look down the barrel of their gun. It's not even that they have these far-left views. It would be equally bad if they were far-right views, or for that matter, centrist views. Ideas that the free market will fix it are misguided. PayPal, GoDaddy and others pulled the rug from under Gab, the free speech alternative to Twitter. Patreon would appear to have been lent on by MasterCard. Separately, there appeared to have been collusion between PayPal and Patreon to cripple an alternative patronage provider, Subscribestar. Maybe people power work here too, as YouTuber law is looking to file a collusion suit with the FTC. The dying mainstream media cheerleads and organises, for example in the case of the deplatforming of InfoWars' Alex Jones, as citizen journalists are crushed. Most everyone is now literally a far-right Nazi, literally like Hitler. We can only see this getting worse coming up to the 2020 US elections. Interestingly, outside the halls of Silicon Valley and Media Valley, and far too many politicians, the world is fed up of PC. Even in the US, where it has been bred, surveys regularly show that people think it's gone far too far. But mad ideas, open borders being the latest mad fad, don't appear out of nowhere. As former President Carter said, the US, I quote, is an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. Ditto Russia, ditto China, and ditto the world with Soros's Open Society Foundation, where $19 billion buys you a hell of a lot of influence. Its fingers are in many pies. I literally felt nauseated when I saw that the FT had made him their Man of the Year for defence of liberal democracy. Crikey Moses, that really was ringing the bell. This is no longer a conspiracy theory, by the way. See, for example, Nigel Farage has made many speeches to the EU on this topic where he quotes official data. There's also that infamous YouTube of some Antifa folk protesting against Soros not having paid them. And back to Chomsky's two-tier society, with a thin layer at the top. Undermining democracy has become all the rage in the UK this year, with politicians and corporate media, as well as the malevolent BBC, portraying anyone who voted for Brexit as a moron, and anyone in the Conservative Party or Labour Party who actually believes in implementing their manifesto commitments as an extremist. The Blairs, Mandelsons and Campbells have escaped from under the stone where they were cast to come out and twist words again. We needed people's votes, they say, totally ignoring the fact that it wasn't cats and dogs that voted last time round, and that in the election, the one party that campaigned to remain, the Liberals, got trashed, and the two parties that campaigned to implement Brexit got 85% of the vote. Power is, and I'm sure this has been part of a long-term plan, flowing to ever more remote levels of world government. The recent ghastly lies have been about the UN Migration Compact, 1 minute advisory, and then when signed mandatory, which makes migration a human right, for God's sake, removes the whole concept of economic or illegal migrants, and proposes to criminalise criticism of this as, yes, you've guessed it, hate speech. Of course, the media tell you this is all false. I actually went to the lengths to download the document and read it for myself, as you can all do. Unsurprisingly, it's not false, sadly. Orwell must be spinning in his grave. As a million tweets have said, 1984 was meant as a warning, not an instruction manual. By the way, the mainstream media portrayed negative slants from indie media as far-right Nazi nonsense. They tried doing this with Jordan Peterson, Cathy Newman's car crash interview. So what you're saying is we should organise a society like lobsters, has now over 13.5 million views on YouTube. Notwithstanding which, is a fully paid-up cry-bully, she hadn't stopped presenting herself since as the victim. Ken Livingstone's autobiography is called If Voting Changed Anything, They'd Abolish It, which I guess sums this up. When I was young, he was the socialist mayor of London, the thorn of all thorns in Thatcher's foot. Now he's a Nazi too, apparently. Who'd have guessed it? But maybe the mistake was thinking that we lived in a democracy in the first place. When I went to school, I guessed that Birmingham was something like 95% British. Now it's less than 50%. No one voted for that. We have nuclear bombs that can kill millions. No one voted for that. At a more mundane fintech level, as Sir Paul Tucker highlighted in LFP119, and for those of you who didn't listen to it, I really recommend that as the one constitutional and practical episode of last year. I say practical because he is talking about FS regulation, how you fintechs are all regulated. As he said, no one votes for regulators who increasingly make laws in an extra-parliamentary way. Of course, apart from the tech phase change and the structure of power shifting to ever more unaccountable structures, be it the UN, the EU, where in passing MEPs can neither propose nor amend legislation, regulators in BigTech or BigFS, we have one of these periodic moral outrages that the US is prone to. The takeover of American society by hysteria. Last time it was Reds under the bed and McCarthyism when everyone was literally like Stalin. Before that it was the Salem witch trials when everyone was literally like, I don't know, Hecate, and that led to more than enough hangings. Now it's Nazis everywhere. Actually, of course, this Nazi alt-right bullshit is starting to wear thin. How they tried to frame Jordan Peterson, again, pretty bloody centrist as far as I'm concerned, as that is beyond me, but it's symptomatic of an appallingly poor education. At least someone could be literally like Mao for a change, or Stalin, or Pol Pot, but no, everyone's only ever literally like Hitler. This time, however, this moral panic, this moral outrage, this religious zealotry, this archetypal inflation feels different to me, as once you deeply divide society on gender, ethnic and sexuality grounds, once you propagandize generations of children along these lines, it's very, very hard to stick Humpty Dumpty together again. I vividly recall myself playing golf at Roehampton when I heard that the Berlin Wall had come down. Suddenly the whole USSR egg cracked, and there was no going back. Internal contradictions got it. But is not internal tribalism and identity politics leading the US the very same way? Does it not risk Humpty Dumpty breaking and not being able to put back together again? It's ongoing, but there's a major backlash, and plenty of commentators are putting a lot of weight on Generation Z as being more conservative. What goes around comes around. Both Dave Rubin, all-round nice guy, left of centre but appalled by the radical left in the US, and Jordan Peterson in Conversation said how Sargon had helped them back in the day when they needed help. These two are part of what's been rather sillily labelled as the intellectual dark web, a motley collection of folks I would simply call high-profile independent content creators who range from Joe Rogan, whose 2 to 3 hour YouTube conversations get millions of views, or Dave Rubin, nice guy interviewers, to the likes of professors such as alt-centrist Peterson and left-leaning Brett Weinstein. All of them stand for the best classical liberal virtues, having respect for the person you're speaking to and engaging them in civilised discourse, always open to evidence. This, of course, contrasts markedly with the screaming, deplatforming ideologues on the extreme left, to whom logic is just part of an oppressive tyranny. Maybe Jonathan Haidt is intellectual dark web too, and his Coddling of the American Mind is an excellent book this year, a very even-handed exploration of what went wrong to produce such a generation of snowflakes who inherit the most prosperous society ever. Anyway, a lot of these IDW folks get big bucks from subscribers and putting tech in their hands. There's a Patreon replacement project underway, albeit given MasterCard's recent arrival as global censor, this is easier said than done. They also have long-running and not yet conceived ideas of how to re-engineer university-level education. Loads of babies born into the most prosperous and rights-enabled societies in existence over all of human time didn't suddenly turn into nihilistic and anti their own kind. The only reasonable racism, as we saw with the New York Times, recruiting proven racist Sarah Jong, you would be totally unpersoned if you used her tweets and replaced the word white with black or Jewish. As another indie, Ben Shapiro, said, America is experiencing a crisis of meaning, and we are filling our need for meaning with whatever we have at our disposal. Drugs, ethnic solidarity, political mobbing. The problem here isn't capitalism and its supposed excesses, or classical liberalism and its atomization of individuals. The problem here is that while we have a bevy of centrifugal forces operating on us, we have very few centripetal forces bringing us together. Another interesting word I came across recently is oikophobia. It sounds like the attitude of most non-working class folks to Tommy Robinson, but it's a more specific definition, as per Roger Scruton. I quote Wikipedia. In his 2004 book, England and the Need for Nations, British conservative philosopher Roger Scruton adapted the word to mean the repudiation of inheritance and home. He argued that it is a stage through which the adolescent mind normally passes, but that it is a feature of some, typically leftist, political impulses and ideologies which espouse xenophilia, i.e. a preference for alien cultures. Scruton uses the term as the antithesis of xenophobia. In his book, Roger Scruton, Philosopher on Dover Beach, Mark Dooley describes oikophobia as centred within the Western academic establishment on both the common culture of the West and the old educational curriculum that sought to transmit its humane values. This disposition has grown out of, for example, the writings of Jacques Derrida and of Michel Foucault's assault on bourgeois society, resulting in an anti-culture that took direct aim at holy and sacred things, condemning and repudiating them as oppressive and power-ridden. End quote. In the US, too much of this is utterly in the grip of far-left ideologues and is more about brainwashing and fomenting dissent aiming at tearing their society apart than it is learning from thousands of years of great men and women who have created our inheritance, often and generally perhaps with huge personal sacrifice in far poorer and harder times. So maybe you want to place an outside bet on tech in the hands of the intellectual dark web as coming to the rescue. Certainly the likes of Brett and Jordan have had their baptisms of fire, although it's such a diverse group whose only thing they have in common is a method of engagement rather than beliefs. How can free speech be restored? I mean, actually that's even a crazy thing, because in the US and I believe in the UK there really is nothing such as hate speech. Incitement to violence and that kind of stuff you're not allowed to do, but that's been the case for pretty much ever. The platform thing is a mess. By cozying up to Washington, the tech giants have so far avoided minor matters like either being a publisher, in which case they're liable for their content, or, like the telephones, being a neutral carrier. Of course, this cozying is helped by the usual US system of buying politicians, lobbying. It's also helped by joining in hysteria about so-called hate speech, Russian bots, and whatever latest self-serving BS comes out of the swamp. Furthermore, as the state and the media have had the monopoly on narrative for basically forever, they're not about to do anything other than continue to lean on speech which exposes the error of their ways or undermines their position. So sadly, we're unlikely to see an Internet Bill of Rights anytime soon. Constitutionalists argue that free speech doesn't apply to corporations. This is typical legalese, as A, especially in the US, corporations have taken every legal right given to people going that they want to, and therefore might as well take some of the liabilities, and B, there were no corporations when the Constitution was written. The founders were most concerned with their history, with the state or religious tyranny they had witnessed in Europe, and hence wrote to hold that in check. If the founders had grown up in an era of state, religious and corporate tyranny, they would have no doubt drafted it wider. They had no idea, of course, what corporate tyranny is, and they couldn't go forward in a time machine and ask Sargon what it's like to have your entire income disappear overnight due to not even breaching terms of service of a provider. Which leaves us with a free market. If you don't fancy your new archbishops of Silicon Valley being the world's moral guardians, what about rolling your own? The free market solves everything, eh? Well, maybe, but what is a free market? See, for example, the problems that Gab has been having trying to create a neutral carrier-type Twitter. A Twitter without Jack Dorsey saying he doesn't like what you're saying and therefore you're out. So the battle has been engaged. So far the empire, aka the politicians, tech billionaires and failing mainstream media, are beating the public, literally and metaphorically. But the Rebel Alliance, those perennial underdogs, are fighting back. The Rebel Alliance has some interesting and random allies. It's not just His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who spoke clearly this year against the cultural destruction of Europe by excessive immigration. As he put it, the only home the Europeans have is Europe. He further added, what is often missed is that emigration of the young harms the countries that they leave. In a similar regard, there's support for this from Africa. I quote, "Many African heads of states are surprised by Europe's open border policy and urge the continent to change it," Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz said to German tabloid Bild. Kurz, who was on a trip in Africa, said some heads of states urged him to stop your policy of open borders in Europe as it leads to African youth leaving the continent. This only motivates the African youth to break up in the first place, the Austrian Chancellor quoted his unnamed counterparts. According to Ethiopian President Saleh Work Zewde, apologies for the pronunciation, my Ethiopian isn't what it might be, it's better if the African youth remained in their countries and don't even want to come to Europe. He said, "It is clear that we must not lose our youth because they flee to Europe. We need to tackle the causes rather than worry about the symptoms. The escape is dangerous. Criminal human smugglers make money with it. We must keep the people who will lead Ethiopia and Africa into a better future." It is for sure an archetypal struggle. Too many animus-possessed women and anima-possessed men. Too many ideologically captured religious zealots of unscientific, unproven or sheer mad beliefs. Too much anarcho-tyranny, harsh treatment of trivia. Hello, Count Dankula, and a complete pass of the worst behaviour, rape and torture gangs. Too much pathological altruism. Witness the Swedish girl on the plane stopping the export of a violent, abusive man. Camus' Grand Remplacement, the Great Replacement. Kalergi's 1920 plan for a united Europe removed nation-states and diluted identity by immigration. Also, bringing this back to tech, tech is enabling lynch mobs to go after whosoever they want. Either scared or ideologically sympathetic corporations fear the fuss and step into line. And not all of this is against the so-called far right. Plenty of it's against the so-called far left. It's just being weaponized by both sides. Anyway, look, this is all a vast topic. I've only touched like a skimming stone on some of the areas that happen to spring to my mind. Power is without a doubt being sucked further and further away from you and me, away from the voters. More and more of your life and my life is being determined by what, for all intents and purposes, might as well be a medieval monarch. And, as we heard, Sir Paul Tucker, former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, has said the same. I'm not in the slightest bit exaggerating on this point about regulators. In particular, I recall speaking to one fintech this year whose income was slashed overnight by the stroke of a regulator's pen changing one line of one regulation. This is not a lot different from Sargon waking up and finding his income was gone, or for the East India Company in the early 1600s suddenly having their charter removed when Queen Elizabeth I died and James took over. Loath as I am to admit it, our former colonial masters, the French, seem to have the right idea. The victory over power concentrating in a few hands and then being abused is never over. Battles are won, but the struggles go on. I always counted myself lucky to be the first generation in England that never had to fight a war. It's only recently dawned on me that maybe this is half true. It's true about external conflict. But let us remember Cicero. A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves amongst those within the gate freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not a traitor. He speaks in accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face and their arguments. He appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of the city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to fear. So you and I may be fortunate. We may not have to hold a gun and murder people en masse for the state. But I'm left thinking, and tech is an enabler, an amplifier of this. Frankly, you couldn't have all the details of regulation to pick something close to home for fintech without computers. Society is being deliberately balkanized, deliberately torn apart, often as this electorally benefits one party. In passing, have you noticed that every promoted lifestyle, LGBT, etc., and in passing there's huge fights within these groups, for example the TERFs versus the trans, that's another story, but every promoted lifestyle is non-reproductive? that all the narratives foisted upon women have the net effect of reducing the number of their offspring? European countries are almost all falling well below the replacement birth rate, which is why the EU and UN wish to have the immigration, apart from trying to remove the nation state. Europe is not only culturally dying out, but is failing to reproduce itself. In all this BS about women, third-wave feminism and gender, the simple fact remains that it is literally only women who give birth to the next generation. If no women have babies, there will be no next generation. What is a more important task than that? Anyway, what do you think? Look, I've spoken more than enough. There's a lot here. I try not to think about it too much, or rather every now and then I get sucked into it and get depressed by it. Like all of us, I don't always think the same thing 2 days in a row. However, back to archetypes, the super busy Jordan Peterson has visited 100 cities this year and spoken to 250,000 people and benefited by their own testimony countless numbers. It turns out that accepting responsibility rather than crying out for yet more rights is transformative. Peterson talks about the archetypal meaning of Jonah rescuing his father from the belly of the whale. The father is archetypally the culture. Does your father need to be rescued from the belly of the whale? Does part of him? Do you generally not know, or upon considered reflection you don't know enough to decide? Anyway, maybe there's some farm boy on Tatooine who'll save us all. We shall see. Barring lightsabers, though, it's up to all of us to use the free speech we have and to protect that which we feel needs protecting. As the possibility of tech that liberates us from the oppression and tyranny of governments and oligopolistic corporates, bring it on. Okay, so look, I am for one very pleased to be moving on to gentler pastures with a year of quotes normal unquotes episodes. I'm quite happy if you don't agree with huge chunks of what I say. They're just illustrations that spring to my mind. However, back to the title, is FS and tech ushering in Orwellian tyranny rather than freeing the people? It is rather hard to believe anything other than, sadly, it's concentrating power in the hands of a few at the moment. Let's hope that changes. Either that, or we should all take a leave from the French and go and buy yellow jackets and get us some of that real rule by the demos. Anyway, failing farm boys from Tatooine, we're all simply at the stage akin to industrialisation where we have tasted the first fruits of progress and liked them, but have noticed that they come with terrible side effects, bad pollution and working conditions. We need to address the side effects that have come in hand with initial fruits of the information revolution. Let us not forget that once Pandora's box is opened, you can't stuff things back into it. On that note, so long and thanks for all the fish, and on a happier note, may you all have a wonderful 2019. For all the challenges we have, we all live in a land of far more opportunity than all of our ancestors, stretching back thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. See you next week. Thanks for listening. If you have consulting, advisory/non-exec or media needs in the FS or fintech space, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could sit in a bender all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight